if I'm pleased, is now back in session. You may be seated. Thank you.
See, all our chairs are filled once again, which, as I've indicated before, is always a good thing after a break. I expect that you got a good lunch and are prepared to dive into the evidence this afternoon. So with that, State of Ohio, you may continue if you have further evidence.
Thank you, Ron. The state would call Dr. Karpowicz to the stand.
Someone sort of testify the truth, the whole truth, and the truth. I do.
Good afternoon, doctor.
Good afternoon.
Could you please give us your full name and spell your last name for us?
Dr. James Karpowicz, Karpawich.
And sir, what is your occupation?
I am a clinical psychologist who is licensed here in Ohio.
And how long have you been a clinical psychologist?
Approximately 30-some years.
And I believe you stated you are licensed here in the state of Ohio, correct?
That's correct.
Since when?
This license when I came here in 1985.
And sir, will you tell us about your background in clinical psychology?
Well, I did my undergraduate work at Georgetown University in Washington, where I was a history honors major and I minored in psychology. I then went to Fordham University in New York, where I got my master's degree in clinical psychology, as well as my PhD in clinical psychology.
And sir, have you practiced in any other states?
Yes, I practiced in California, Massachusetts, as well as here in Ohio, and early in my career in North Carolina.
And what is a clinical psychologist?
A clinical psychologist is an individual who's trained to evaluate individuals to detect if there's signs of mental illness, personality problems, substance abuse problems. So a clinical psychologist works on a one-to-one basis in evaluating individuals through interview, record review, and testing.
And sir, what are your current positions?
Currently, I am, and I have been working at a community mental health center in Akron for more than 25 years. That is where I am a clinical psychologist, where I treat and evaluate people with mental illness, severe mental illnesses. It's called Community Support Services. I also consult for the Forensic Center, which is located in Cambridge. In Ohio, there are 10 forensic centers located around the state that do evaluations for the courts. I've done many evaluations for this court here in the Forensic Center that's located up in Akron. I'm an adjunct professor at Mount Union University, and I also do forensic evaluations that I'm contacted by the court, the prosecutor, or the defense.
Now, with regards to forensic evaluations, is that different than clinical psychology?
Basically, I was trained as a clinical psychologist first. I then got training in the interface between people with mental illness and people who may be involved with the legal system. So, for instance, my training as a clinical psychologist had to do with children, adolescents, and adults, both in hospitals as well as in community mental health centers. I then went to California and did a second internship of individuals who were involved with the legal system, again, primarily providing treatment for them. They were in the county jail, and the assessment was, do they need counseling? Do they need to be admitted to the hospital? Those type of issues. I then did a fellowship, which is passed once I got my license, to go back and do further training at the University of Southern California, the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Behavioral Sciences. And that's where I learned to use my clinical skills, not to just do therapy or treatment, but to address legal issues that might be in front of the court. Things like competency to stand trial, or the insanity at the time of the act, or child custody. So that's where I used my clinical skills and learned how to address legal issues. So that would be the difference.
So how long would you say in your career you have worked with forensic evaluations?
I finished my fellowship in 1985. So that's been 30 years.
And I believe you indicated you treat people, correct?
That's correct.
You do evaluations for the court.
Correct.
Previously, there had been a term malingering. Are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
And is that a term of art in your field?
Is that a term?
Term of art or a phrase in your field of expertise?
Well, yes, it is. Malingering is when someone comes in and they are just faking symptoms or they're exaggerating their problems. And one of the number of things at the Community Mental Health Center besides therapy, I get the referrals from the psychiatrist to evaluate people to see are they legitimately mentally ill or are they just faking symptoms. And people can very realistically fake symptoms. They can claim they're hearing voices. They can look disturbed. They can cry. These could all be signs of legitimate mental illness or faking. Why they refer them to me is I would then get records. I would also do testing. So I never take at face value what someone tells me, because I don't know if they're telling me the truth or not. But if someone comes in and says, I was hospitalized, I was hearing voices, and they called me something from schizophrenia, get the hospital records and found out they weren't hospitalized for a week. They're hospitalized overnight, and the drug screen was high on cocaine and PCP. So they might have told me one thing, but to do a thorough evaluation, I get the records to assess, is this truthful? There's also tests to say, is this person exaggerating some symptoms? Is he or she claiming to have symptoms that people with legitimate mental illnesses do not have? So that would be another part of the evaluation. And the third part would just be the interview, but the interview by itself doesn't give you a diagnosis.
And sir, for how many years have you been doing that kind of evaluation?
I was doing that since I've been a clinical psychologist in the early 1980s. Prior to becoming doing forensic work, I've also worked in prisons, state, federal, and county jails. And that was also an issue there because some people could be faking symptoms just to get medication. So that was an issue. So you have to be trained as a good clinician, but you also have to be trained to not just rely on what someone tells you, but look at other information that you have.
And sir, have you ever previously testified in a court of law?
Yes, I have.
How many times have you testified in a court of law in the state of Ohio, if you can approximate?
Approximately more than 100 times.
Have you testified in any other courts outside of the state of Ohio?
Yes, when I was in California, I testified there. I was the director of a court clinic in Boston, Massachusetts, so I testified there as well. But primarily, my work has been centered here in Ohio.
And sir, during the time that you have done evaluations and have testified, can you state whether or not you've ever testified for the defense?
Yes, I have.
And have you ever testified for the state?
Yes, I have.
Can you give us an approximation of the number of times for each side you may have presented an opinion in your fields for each side?
Well, I've done most of my evaluations for these court clinics or forensic centers, where the judge sends an individual to be evaluated. So more than 90% of what I've done for evaluations has been for the judge, not for the defense, not for the prosecution. I worked at the court clinic in Cleveland, the one in Mansfield. I'm still working at the one located in Cambridge. Also worked at the one in Akron and the one in Youngstown. So these evaluations are being done for the judge, not for defense or prosecution. So 90% of the time, my evaluations have been for the court, and probably 6% for the 6-7% for the defense, 3% for the prosecution, rough estimate.
And sir, how many times have you been qualified as an expert in clinical psychology?
Again, over 100 times whenever I've testified.
And have you been qualified as an expert in clinical psychology here in the Stark County Court of Common Pleas?
Yes, I've testified here in Stark County between 1988 and now approximately 15 to 25, 30 times.
Your Honor, at this time I would move to have Dr. Karpowicz notified as an expert in the area of clinical psychology.
No objection, Your
All
Honor.
right, you will be so designated.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, were you asked to evaluate the defendant, Colleen McKernan, as it relates to battered woman syndrome?
Yes, I was.
And do you recall when you were asked to make that evaluation? Approximately.
I was asked in the fall of 2015.
And when did you prepare your report as to your findings?
I evaluated her, interviewed her on October 23rd, 2015. My report was completed on December 4th, 2015.
And sir, can you give us a general description of battered woman syndrome to the jury and what you used to apply in this particular matter?
Battered woman syndrome is a theoretical construct or description which is not qualified as any diagnosis because it's never been notified as a diagnosis in the field of psychology or psychiatry. But as a descriptive term, it means that an individual, and again, it started off as battered woman syndrome, but it's changed over the years to battered spouse syndrome or intimate violence, that an individual in a relationship is so beaten down physically or psychologically by the person's spouse that they become passive, they become dependent, they have what they call learned helplessness, that they can no longer function. So all these factors come into play. It's not just the fact that there may be abuse in a relationship, it's the psychological impact on the individual.
And sir, has there been any studies as it relates to battered woman syndrome within the last couple of years?
There's a lot of studies that have gone on. The concept first came out around 1980, and again it was called battered woman syndrome, because at the time it was primarily women that were identified as the ones who were subject to the battering and not being able to stand up for themselves. Since then, the research has indicated that it's not just women that can be subject in a battered relationship. It can also be men. And in fact, research over the past 10, 15 years have shown a decline in women who have been the victims of battering and an increase in the number of men who have been in battered relationships. When victims can report that the other person, the perpetrator, grabbed them or shoved them, but when it comes to violence, extreme violence, 4% of women indicated that they have been attacked by a gun or a knife, but 8% of the male victims have. So when it comes to physical violence, the man is often subject to more lethal weapons of violence than just grabbing or shoving.
And sir, so fair to say gender is not a definitive factor in evaluating these types of cases?
No, it's not. Even though we use the term battered woman syndrome here in Ohio, the research has indicated it's battered spouse syndrome or intimate relationship syndrome, that it's not just sex-oriented.
Okay.
That is the phrase in Ohio.
And sir, when you are given a case to evaluate, can you tell us what you are looking for?
The first thing is the person could tell me anything. Is there any corroboration? Is there any signs that what this person is telling me, is there any evidence that supports this as being true or not? Second thing, is the person consistent when they tell me the same story that they may have told to another doctor? The third, are there any psychological factors going on that you would expect in someone with a battered woman syndrome? Depression, anxiety, being frail, being helpless, not able to defend themselves, low self-esteem. Those are all characteristics looking at. Battered woman syndrome is considered maybe a subset of post-traumatic stress disorder, so you can test for that. Does the person show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder? So you listen to what the individual tells you. You'll look at other records, anything else available. Is supported by anything else? Or is it just someone's story? And then testing can rule out if there's signs of post-traumatic stress disorder or not.
And did you do those things in this particular case?
Yes, I did.
And I believe you indicated you met with the defendant, correct?
That's correct.
And prior to meeting with her, did you review any documents?
Yes, I did.
And For what purpose would you review documents prior to meeting with an individual you were evaluating?
You review documents prior to have some idea of who this person is. The more documents that you get ahead of time, the better. Generally what happens though, I have to meet with someone, get releases signed, and then maybe get their hospital records later once they've signed releases of information. So the records that you have, it helps conceptualize a little bit about the person before you go into the interview.
And do you recall approximately when you met with the defendant?
Yes, I do.
I believe, did you previously testify it was October 23rd, 2015? Is that
That's
correct? And can you please describe for us your meeting with the defendant?
I met with her in my office. We were together for 7 hours and 45 minutes. During that time, we took several breaks. After about 5.5 hours, I asked if she wanted to stop for the day because I didn't want to get into details about her relationship with Rob that might cause her too much stress. Once I opened that line of questioning, I wanted to give her sufficient time to discuss everything she wanted to discuss on that. During that evaluation, we did do testing, which was about 1.5 hours of the evaluation.
Sir, during that period of time, you indicated 7.5 hours?
7 hours and 45 minutes.
And can you please describe the defendant's emotional state during this meeting?
I had read Dr. Resnick's report that indicated that she was anxious, tearful, and depressed. During those 7+ hours, there were no signs of depression, no tears, no crying, very little anxiety. In fact, the only anxiety she showed was when I asked her to do some tests of concentration. And I remarked how this was very different than her presentation earlier. And she said this was only the 3rd time that she had discussed all these details with someone. So she came in very talkative, provided with a lot of information, but no strong emotions that any of this was upsetting.
And sir, you met with her in October. Do you recall the date that she had met with Dr. Resnick as noted in his particular report?
It was during the summer. It was in July of 2015, so it was approximately 3-4 months later.
And sir, at any point in time during your meeting with her, was there any terms of art that were discussed?
Could you explain that, please?
Yes, during your meeting with her, did the defendant use any particular terms in discussing this story with you as to what she knew about the situation and discussing your evaluation?
During the evaluation, when I was discussing her relationship with Rob, she used the term cycle of violence, which is a phrase used for battered woman syndrome.
And sir, in that meeting with the defendant, was there any indication that she had reviewed any documentation prior to her interview with you on October 23rd, 2015?
Yes.
And what did she indicate that she had reviewed?
I was surprised she had used that term because it is a term used for people with battered woman syndrome. And I asked her about that phrase. Where did she pick up that phrase? She said that she had worked in a shelter for women who've been battered up in Buffalo about 5 years earlier. And that's when she did research and learned about battered woman syndrome. I asked if she had read anything else about that, and she was vague. She did say is that her attorney had advised her to do no research on battered woman syndrome before she came in and saw me. So I don't know when she reviewed any information about that.
Did she indicate she had reviewed any other documentation other than it relates to specifically battered woman syndrome?
Yes.
And in general, what did she indicate she had reviewed?
By the time that she saw me, she indicated that all the information that the court and the prosecutor had given to her attorney, she had reviewed all that information. So it wasn't like evaluating, I do most defendants, they have not seen what they call the discovery. They have not seen the police reports. They have not seen the records. They have not seen the witness statements. In this case, she indicated that she has received all that material, so that when I asked her questions, she knew exactly who had said what to the police. So that made it much more challenging because she already knew what people said. So rather than giving a spontaneous comment, she knew exactly who said what. When I would say somebody said this, she would say, oh, that was so-and-so. So she knew that very well what witnesses had said.
And sir, did you review any other items after you spoke to Ms. McKernan that you were unable to prior to meeting with her?
Yes.
And what document or item was that?
Well, before I met with her, I also had looked at the police reports and audio tapes of 911 calls. I was not able to see the DVDs like after the offense of what happened, so I had to review that after I interviewed her. The DVD that I had just didn't work on my computer, so I had to use another computer to review that before I wrote my report.
And sir, other than the interview, you reported that you performed some testing.
That's correct.
Could you tell us what that testing was?
In most cases, I'll do a screening test to get someone's intellectual ability, see if there's any problems there. In this case, her IQ is in the average range. Then I look to see if there's any major cognitive deficits or neurological deficits. In this case, she had no serious problems with her orientation, her memory, her executive functioning. She did show some mild problems on a test which tested attention and concentration, but that could be due to anxiety. Her reading level is intact. And then I needed the reading level before I would give her the personality testing, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the second edition. So that she sat down and she completed that in about an hour and 15 minutes. So it's 567 true-false items.
And sir, are those tests specific to battered woman syndrome, or are those tests that you would perform in an evaluation in which you are asked to render an opinion?
In most of my evaluations, I will screen out for intellectual functioning, any cognitive impairment, neuropsych testing. The MMPI in this case was primarily used to see if she fulfilled the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder or any other mental illness. The test is also very good because some people may be faking bad on it, but other people may come across as faking that they are overly virtuous, that they have no faults at all. So that kind of gets into their test-taking attitude. How do they portray themselves?
And doctor, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty as to whether the defendant qualified as a battered woman?
Yes, I do.
And what is your opinion?
It's my opinion that she does not qualify for the criteria of battered woman syndrome.
And sir, can you describe to the jury the reasons behind your opinion? Now, it is my understanding there are quite a few components of the battered woman syndrome. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And how many are there, approximately, if you can remember?
Well, again, we have to say that this is not a valid diagnosis, okay? So there's no criteria that the psychiatry or psychology have come up with as a profession that this is a valid diagnosis. Because it relies so much on self-report, it's not very reliable, it's not very valid. But when the idea first came up with the idea of battered woman syndrome, there was some descriptive terms that you can see if an individual fulfills. So there are certain criteria under that, but again, these criteria have never been supported by the extensive research that has been done on the topic.
And sir, if would it help if I referred to each particular term one at a time so we could discuss them?
That's correct.
Okay. Is one of the components or terms that has been discussed with regards to battered woman syndrome a learned helplessness?
Okay.
What is that?
Learned helplessness is when an individual in a relationship is so beaten down after time that they get into a state of helplessness. Their esteem, low self-esteem, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're passive, they're dependent, their function is impaired. They become isolated, they have no friends, and they're just in this relationship and they can't get out of it. So it's very isolated, they become hopeless and helpless. So this is a learned behavior that they are just beaten down, and this is the result.
And sir, did you look at that particular component when evaluating the defendant and with regards to her relationships with Rob McKernan?
Yes, I did.
And what was your opinions as to your finding with regards to that particular component?
That's a very significant component with a lot of aspects of it. She did not fulfill any of those descriptive terms that I gave you. She didn't admit that she was ever helpless. She described herself in very strong, positive ways. The records that I looked at described her as a strong alpha-type individual who, wanted control over his situations. Testing did not show signs of any depression, any anxiety, any low self-esteem, any sense of helplessness or hopelessness. So all the characteristics that would come under learned helplessness, she had none of them. And she didn't admit any of them or tell any of them, according to Dr. Resnick's report or myself, that she was beaten down, that she was helpless. Instead, she described herself as very strong, confident, bright, stronger than most individuals. That's the opposite of learned helplessness.
Sir, moving on to another component or factor, I believe, is a lowered self-esteem.
Correct.
And did you look at that particular component with regards to the defendant and her relationship with Mr. McKernan?
Yes, I did.
And what was your opinion with regards to the defendant with regards to that particular component?
She didn't show any signs of low self-esteem. None of the reports of witnesses ever described her as an individual with low self-esteem. She didn't use that phrase about herself. She saw herself as a confident individual that was in control and that would succeed. That's the description that individuals gave the police about her. Again, testing did not indicate that she had any low self-esteem.
Again, I believe another term is depression.
Correct.
And did you apply, well, let me ask you this. In the evaluation of battered woman syndrome, is that a clinical diagnosis of depressions you were looking for or symptoms of a depression in general?
It could be either. It could be someone could be so battered down that they are severely depressed. Some could just have a depressed mood.
And sir, did you look at that particular component when evaluating the defendant with regards to her relationship with Rob?
Yes, I did.
And what is your opinion with regard to that particular component?
Again, she did not report any symptoms of depression. Nobody that saw her, friends, that told the police no one described her as a depressed individual. Testing did not show any signs of depression.
Another major component, I believe, is that of fear or terror. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And was that a component that you evaluated with regards to the defendant and her relationship with Rob?
Yes, it was.
And what was your finding and your opinion with regards to that particular component?
Again, she did not describe herself that was in fear of her husband. In fact, she ridiculed her husband throughout the interview. She spoke negatively about him. She criticized him for not having good credit. She criticized him for being a bad parent. She criticized him when she first met him for not having a job. She was no signs that she was fearful of him. She was more critical of him, and she was telling him what to do. So it wasn't cowering, afraid of him. She was the one in charge, and he needed to do what she wanted. So there were no signs of that as part of their relationship.
Next one, I believe, another one is an impaired functioning. Is that correct?
Correct.
What does that mean?
That means when a woman is so battered down, they no longer socialize, they no longer go out of the house. And I've dealt with women that have been battered, and they are reduced to just being isolated. Colleen had a very successful job. She got a promotion after a year. There was no impairment in her social functioning, her occupational functioning, or intellectual functioning. Again, strong, confident individual. There was no low functioning or impaired functioning.
Another term, I believe, is a diminished alternative or a feeling of being trapped.
That's correct.
All right. And what does that refer to? What does that mean?
The women that I've dealt with who have been in bad relationships, they are trapped. They have no friends. They've been cut off from their family. They have no resources. They have no money. They're dependent upon their spouse to support them. So there's no financial alternatives. There is no social alternatives. They're just trapped in this relationship. She was the antithesis of this. Had a good relationship with her family, she told me, good relationship with friends. Rob was on the road a lot, so she was out pursuing her career, spending time with friends. She wasn't isolated in the home by herself with no alternatives. I talked to her about finances were an issue. She complained about the way that Rob handled finances. She owned the house, so she wasn't dependent upon him. She had good credit. She said he didn't. So I asked her why she didn't get her own credit, her own bank account, if she was concerned. And she indicated that if she did, Rob would expect that she would contribute 50% to the household, and she didn't think that was fair. So again, we're having a woman that has her own resources, her own home, her own friends, her own family. This is not someone that had no alternatives, either socially or financially.
And sir, I believe another one is a cycle of violence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And when referring to a cycle of violence in your field, can you please describe what you mean by that?
When the concept first came out, the Lenore Walker, who came up with the idea of battered woman syndrome, indicated that there was a cycle of a tension-building stage in the relationship. Then there was the act of violence, and then there was a contrition stage. So this would be the cycle of violence. Then eventually the tension would start building again. About 5 years later, she said, 65%, only 65% of people have this contrition stage. Less than that have the tension-building stage. So even though that's used, research indicates a lot of people in battered relationships don't have this cycle of violence. So that is something that has not been supported by research. Colleen herself did not indicate that there was tension-building stages. That would mean that things in the household were building up, and the woman who was being battered would try to please her mate not to get angry. None of that went on in the relationship. So she reported no increase in tension in the relationship before one of the incidents in which they had their arguments.
And sir, out of those 7 major components, did the defendant meet the criteria for any of those particular 7 components?
No, she did not meet the criteria of any of those.
And when that criteria is not met, I believe you indicated you would look to other things to evaluate. Is that correct?
I would look to see the possibility of we dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder as opposed to battered woman syndrome.
Okay. Prior to moving on to the post-traumatic stress disorder, in dealing specifically with the issue of battered women syndrome, in addition, I believe you talked about speaking to the individual and doing the evaluation. Are you looking for any other specific items? I believe you referred to corroboration.
Yes.
What are you looking for?
If someone tells me they're in an abusive relationship, and again, I've treated and evaluated people, what corroborates that that's true? What other information supports that that is valid, that that actually is happening? So number one, you look to hospital records. Are there any hospital records that indicated this person's been in the emergency room? Any injuries? I've seen those, none in this case. Are there any police reports that this has been going on? In this case, there haven't been any police reports. Do witnesses talk about there was abuse in the relationship? Maybe witnesses saw bruises on her. Maybe witnesses said that they saw her being victimized. That's not true in this case. I've seen pictures and even videos of women in abusive relationships with black eyes and being demeaned by their spouse. None of that exists here. So nothing that can support this was an abusive relationship came forward. There was no support that she was the victim of physical abuse in the relationship.
And sir, I believe you said the next step would be to look at post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you indicated some of the testing you performed were related to that particular disorder?
That's correct.
And were those, was that testing and evaluation done specifically to Ms. McKernan?
Yes, I gave the MMPI, which could test for a wide range of different personality, like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. In this case, she didn't show any signs of anxiety or depression, any major thought disorder, any symptoms that would be treatable. So there were no signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. And she also didn't report any signs where you have intrusive thoughts, those type of things, flashbacks. She didn't give me, during the interview, any signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sorry.
And sir, in your review of the information that you were provided, as well as the interview with the defendant and your testing, was there anything that you noted about any incidents that were described and an escalation during these particular incidents?
I don't understand the question. Can you rephrase it, please?
I will try. Do you recall in your review of the documentation the specific incidents that the defendant referred to you, told you specifically about as it related to her and Rob?
She gave me stories of a couple different cases where there were incidents between the two of them.
And in those particular incidents, as she described them, was there any information contained in them with regards to whom escalated an argument? Started it, escalated, anything like that?
Her report to me, and again confirmed by friends, she started most of the arguments. She wouldn't like the way he was driving, she wouldn't like his finances, so she would often start the arguments, which is the opposite of a woman who was in a battered relationship, who would be so afraid to ever offend the person if they really felt cowed by fear. So she indicated that she would raise an issue, she would start the argument would then escalate between the two of them, and she reported that on a couple occasions it became physical.
And sir, did she give you any reasoning as it related to her ability or her decision to not leave this particular relationship?
She gave me several reasons why she did not want to leave the relationship.
And sir, can you tell us what the reasons were that she provided to you?
Number one was embarrassment. She didn't like to feel that she was a failure at anything. She indicated that when she got married, she feels that people could always work out their marriage. She didn't want family and friends and co-workers to know that her marriage had failed. She talked about her co-workers, said that she got divorced, that would spread throughout the office. So the number one thing is she did not want to be embarrassed as someone that did not succeed at the marriage. She expressed concern about that she claimed that Rob had threatened to harm her pets. She claimed that Rob had threatened to destroy that he would hurt her, and that was never one of the reasons.
And sir, is that consistent with someone who would fall under the battered woman syndrome?
No, that's not. That's usually the number one issue, is the person does not want to leave for fear that they will be harmed. And she did not give me that reason. Looking at Dr. Resnick's report, she did not give Dr. Resnick that reason.
And it's my understanding that you were able to review the video or DVD of the defendant immediately after this incident when she was at the Massillon Police Department. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were able to review that item in its entirety?
Yes.
And were you able to look at and review her demeanor at that point in time?
Yes, I was.
And what was it about her demeanor or her appearance at that particular period of time that you reviewed and what you noted?
The video indicates that she was calm for most of that time, then all of a sudden she would burst out and start crying and then become calm again. What struck me is she was telling the police officers what they should do and how they should do the job. So rather than being distraught or anxious and depressed, several times she told the police, you need to do a blood alcohol level on me. She actually even confronted police officers who were talking, confronting them, what are you talking about? Again, in my view, that she was putting control over the situation, not that she was upset, that she was depressed, that she was anxious. There were bouts of crying, but then there was a calm demeanor, and with her making requests, asking questions, providing very specific information when asked about background, social security numbers, those type of things.
And sir, during your review of that particular item, did you make any note with regards to any topics related to battered women syndrome that arose?
There was no signs of depression, anxiety, helpless, hopeless, low self-esteem, that she was beaten down. That I didn't find any that would justify that.
And sir, did you make any observations in those particular videos as to any statements the defendant herself made while at the Massillon Police Department that related to battered women syndrome or violence in general?
Yes, I did.
And what were those?
What struck me is shortly after the murder, she starts talking about battered women syndrome. I'm sorry.
You can approach. motion is overruled. You may continue, Ms. Day.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, I believe you had indicated that you had reviewed this particular DVD of Ms. McKernan the evening of the incident until the following morning prior to completing your report, correct?
That's correct.
And you made observations with regards to that particular video, correct?
That's correct.
And were there any statements made by Ms. McKernan in that particular video that you observed with regards to discussions about battered women?
Yes, there was.
And what were those statements?
After she had been at the police station for approximately 1 hour, she told the police that she had worked in the homeless shelter in Buffalo about 5 years earlier, and she started quoting statistics about battered women. And she said it took a woman 7 times for them to make a police report, and that 1 additional time to leave the man. Research often indicates that women in battered relationships do leave their spouse 5 to 7 times before they finally do leave. But I thought that was extremely odd. 1 hour after the incident, she's quoting statistics to the police about battered woman syndrome.
And sir, is that consistent with someone who would fall under the battered woman syndrome?
No, it's not consistent with someone who would be depressed, anxious, cowing. That's the complete opposite.
And sir, since you completed your report in December of 2015, have you had the ability, strike that. I believe you had previously indicated you had reviewed Dr. Resnick's report at the time you interviewed the defendant and prepared your report, correct?
That's correct.
And in your review of Dr. Resnick's report, did you have any specific concerns as it related to your field of clinical psychology and with regards to the evaluation of the defendant as a battered woman?
Yes.
And what was your specific concern that you noted?
In the field of clinical psychology or psychiatry, or in the field of forensic psychology or psychiatry, to do a thorough evaluation means that you interview the individual, you look at other available information, you do testing, and then you form an opinion based on all that information. You don't just listen to what someone tells you, repeat it back, and make a decision based on that. And in his report, he specifically stated that based solely on Ms. McKernan's account, she was a battered woman. So even though he noted that he reviewed all this information, he did not include any of that in making his opinion. So he simply made his opinion by taking what she took, hook, line, and sinker, and said, based on what she says, she fulfills the criteria. That's not how a thorough forensic evaluation goes. You have to take what someone tells you, but you also have to compare it to other information. Does it support it, yes or no? And ideally also do testing and get other records. You don't just rely on what someone tells you.
And sir, fair to say that in your expert report as well as Dr. Resnick, you've both listed out numerous items that you had been provided and may have reviewed, correct?
Correct. We looked like we reviewed almost all the same items.
Okay. And fair to say, when you did your evaluation, you did not use every single item you were provided as a basis for your opinion.
That's correct.
And now you referred to that particular statement with Dr. Resnick. Other than referring to her statement, does he incorporate into his opinion, based on your reading of it, any other documents?
I saw no information in his report at all that he referred to any other document, any other source of information, police report, video, when he made his opinion.
And so there's a difference between being provided and reviewing the items and in using it in rendering an opinion.
That's correct.
Okay. And sir, it's also my understanding at some point in time you were provided and had the opportunity to review the report of a Dr. Lubit.
That's correct.
And Specifically, I've just a few questions for you with regards to this, sir. I believe Dr. Lubit has testified with regards to a dissociative state. Are you familiar with that particular theory and have any expertise in that area?
Yes, I have. I've dealt with people who have claimed to be in a dissociative state. Many of them are not, because you can't prove it one way or another as a psychologist who's examining someone. If they said, I don't remember, dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder, that I don't remember doing these things, and it's an attempt that many defendants have claimed to use, that it wasn't me, it might have been my alternative personality. The field does not widely accept that anymore. So you can't necessarily claim when someone's in a dissociative state. In this case, he's not even talking about minutes or hours. I think he's talking about 2 or 3 seconds, which is not consistent with what she told Dr. Resnick and what she told me.
And sir, specifically with regards to the information related to that dissociative state, I believe you indicated that you were talking about a few seconds, correct?
That's correct.
And with regards to that particular period of time that Dr. Lubit had said she was in a dissociative state, what were the factual inconsistencies that you noted in Dr. Resnick's report, what she told you about that same period of time, and what she indicated to Dr. Lubit?
Objection. Sustained. I don't know how many questions there were in there, but that was really confusing. Can you please rephrase?
Absolutely, Your Honor. Sir, did you find inconsistencies in the statements of Ms. McKernan as it related to those seconds at the time prior to the shooting and during the shooting?
Objection. Overruled.
Yes.
And what were those inconsistencies?
When she met with Dr. Lubit, she said she did not recall pulling the trigger or hearing the shots. And then she just remembered pointing the gun at the wall. When she was evaluated by Dr. Resnick, she told him that she estimated that the shooting took 3 seconds. Well, if you were really in a dissociative state, you couldn't estimate how long it occurred. That's inconsistent. And she told Dr. Resnick specifically she estimated that would be 3 seconds. She also said that with me, she said that she still was pulling the trigger when the noise stopped. And she explained the noise being the gunshots. So with me, she admits she's shooting, she hears the gun stop. So there is no there's not even 3 seconds there. So she can tell Resnick exactly how long it occurred. She could tell me that she was still pulling the trigger when the shooting stopped. And she told all of us that she remembered him coming towards her. So I'm not sure what we're talking about with the dissociative state. It's just not consistent with the information.
And sir, when you referred to the statements to Dr. Resnick and the estimated 3 seconds, was there any indication in that document that she had received that timing from any other individual?
No. In Dr. Resnick's report, it's clear that and he used the word estimated, that it took 3 seconds, not that she was told that she herself estimated that.
May I have a brief moment, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, just one last question. Doctor, are all the opinions that you provided here today provided to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty?
Yes, they are.
I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Day. Ms. Mills?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
My name is Laura Mills, and I represent Colleen McKernan. If at any point in time you don't understand a question, please ask me to rephrase it. Okay.
Thank you.
I want to start kind of backwards. Let's start with the dissociation that you were just testifying to. Have you ever testified in a court of law relative to dissociation?
If you have to explain what that means, because it's a broad term that could mean multiple personality disorder or just a blackout for a short time.
I am not discussing multiple personality disorders today, so it would be a dissociated state that a person experienced. Have you ever sat in the witness box and testified in a court of law that someone experienced a dissociated state?
I have testified that someone has reported a blackout for a few seconds. That could be interpreted as a dissociative state or just a blackout.
I understand, doctor. My question is specific to dissociation. Have you ever sat in a witness box and used the term disassociation in a court of law before today, relative to a short period of time?
No, I have not.
And when you were testifying relative to Colleen saying that she recalled pulling the trigger until she didn't hear the sound anymore, do you recall that testimony?
She said that she was still pulling the trigger when the noise stopped.
When the noise stopped. And you certainly can't say that that noise was the sound of pulling a trigger, correct?
No, when I asked her, what do you mean by the noise, she said the gunshot, the shooting.
You specifically asked her that question.
Yes, and that's why it's in my report says noise, parentheses, shooting.
Okay, so when you have in your report, because I've seen that, noise, parentheses, shooting, that indicated that you had a specific question to Colleen and that she gave you a specific answer?
That's correct. She used the phrase noise stopped. I asked her, what do you mean by noise? She said shooting.
Okay. But if I were just to pick up your report and read that without your explanation, I wouldn't know that you had followed up with her, correct?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
And doctor, I think you interviewed Colleen, correct me if I'm wrong, approximately 7 or 8 months, I guess, doctor, after the shooting, correct?
It was approximately 10 months. It was in October.
10 months, okay. And you have no idea in that 10-month time frame whether or not that she heard that most likely that shooting occurred in 3 seconds, do you?
Your Honor. I'm not going to sustain or overrule it because I need you to repeat the question.
I can do that. I can do that. Doctor, in the 10 months between the time of the shooting and the time that you interviewed Colleen, you have no way of knowing whether or not someone had indicated to her that that shooting most likely took place in 3 minutes, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Overruled.
I'm just stating what she told Dr. Resnick. I don't know.
You don't know any other source.
I
It's
don't
fair
know
to
the
say.
source.
Doctor, how many times have you testified in a court of law relative to battered woman syndrome?
Someplace between 5 to 20 times. I can't estimate any less than that.
Okay, that's quite a difference, 5 to 20 times.
That's correct.
Okay, you have no idea whether it's 5 or whether or not it's 20.
Someplace between 5 and 15. I can just give you an estimate. I've done this for 30 years.
Okay, so over a 30-year time span, you have testified in a court of law relative to battered woman syndrome, correct?
Yes.
And I know that you indicated that battered woman syndrome is not a diagnosis, correct?
That's correct.
But you do recognize that it's the law, that the Ohio legislature has recognized battered woman syndrome, correct?
Your Honor, as to the characterization of it as being the law, you can rephrase that portion. And I will just indicate once again, ladies and gentlemen, anytime there is a phrase, a term of art, or anything that involves a legal term that is being discussed, that may or may not have application to this case, that those will be defined for you by me in your jury instructions. And anything outside of that that you find that conflicts with the instructions that I give you, you are to rely upon the instructions, okay? With that, you can continue.
Thank you. The state of Ohio recognizes battered woman syndrome, correct, doctor?
That's correct.
And of the either 5 or 15 times that you have testified relative to battered woman syndrome, did you testify that the woman did in fact have battered woman syndrome?
Objection, Your Honor.
Counsel approach. The objection is sustained. You can rephrase and ask another question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, in the cases in which you have been hired as an expert, how many cases in which your expertise was utilized did you find that a woman was suffering from battered woman syndrome?
There are cases that I've written reports on and testified that the woman was suffering from battered woman syndrome, other cases not.
And on the cases in which you found that a woman was suffering from battered woman syndrome, how many?
I can't give you a number under oath. I have to be probably roughly 30 to 40%, maybe 40%.
Okay, in 40% of the cases, you find battered women syndrome.
When I've been asked to evaluate, correct, that they would fulfill that criteria, approximately.
Does that 40% apply to the either 5 or 15 cases that you gave me previously?
Again, you're just asking me for numbers, and I really can't be any more specific than that.
How about the last time you consulted on a case that you found that a woman had battered woman syndrome?
The last 2 times is in one case, it was my opinion that she suffered from battered woman syndrome. It did not go to trial because there was strong evidence that she had been beaten by her boyfriend, and she was isolated, she was alone, depressed. The second time is I am going to be scheduled to testify next month in Cuyahoga County.
I'm going to stop you for a second. I don't want to get into details.
Okay.
If you could just answer
So that
when.
would be 2.
2 cases. Thank you,
The
Doctor.
last 2 cases I've seen suffer from battered woman syndrome.
And Doctor, just going to some of the items, I believe that Ms. Day went through a number of criteria with you relative to battered women syndrome. Do you recall that testimony?
That's correct.
Okay. And learned helplessness for one of the 7. And in each one of the criteria that she gave you, it is not a requirement to have that criteria in order to suffer from battered woman syndrome, correct?
No, you have to have some psychological problems to say you suffer from battered woman syndrome, not just you were in a relationship, but you have to show some symptoms or signs that would fulfill that.
I understand, Doctor, but my question is specific to the criteria that you were asked. Not every woman has to suffer from the criteria that you went through in order to have battered woman syndrome, correct?
Every woman has to show signs of some of those criteria, maybe not all.
Not every woman has to have learned helplessness, correct?
They all don't have to have it, that's correct.
Okay. Not all women have to be a shrinking violet, correct?
That's correct, not all.
Doctor, you were giving some statistics earlier relative to men and women in battered relationships. Do you recall?
That's correct.
Where did you find those statistics?
U.S. Department of Justice, Center for Disease Control have come up with research that indicated the significant increase in men who have been in battered relationships compared to women.
And in the CDC report that you just mentioned, did you read the CDC report that came out in 2015?
No, I did not.
You did not?
No.
Okay, so you're not aware that 1 in 4 women are abused, where it is 1 in 7 men that have been abused. Were you aware of those statistics?
I've seen statistics changing that it is 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which was more recent. I did not see that specific one for 2015.
You would agree, though, that the CDC report in 2015 is the most recent report that the CDC has issued, correct?
The most recent for that, that's correct.
And the psychological realities between women who suffer from battered women syndrome, they vary on a case-by-case basis. Would you agree?
Definitely, it's a case-by-case basis.
And a battered woman can have a normal MMPI. Is that correct?
Don't know what you mean by the word normal.
The MMPI results would be normal or valid, wouldn't indicate any type of mental illness, correct?
Again, if the individual, if they're suffering from anxiety, that would come across depression, so there's different characteristics. Valid means is she being honest when she answers the questions?
And I appreciate that. But speaking just specifically to kind of normal results from an MMPI, meaning that you're not picking up a PTSD, you're not picking up a specific mental illness. A woman could have a normal MMPI and still suffer from battered woman syndrome, correct?
Again, I have some concerns with the word normal, but she could be suffering from battered woman syndrome with not any significant elevations on depression or anxiety. That would be correct.
Okay, so that would be correct, that you could read her MMPI results. You might not pick anything up on the MMPI, but yet she could still suffer from battered woman syndrome, correct?
That's possible, yes.
Okay. And you indicated that a valid MMPI result indicated that the individual is being truthful in her answers, correct?
Objection, Your Honor.
You just tested.
Okay, can we not testify from there? Thank you. Overruled. You can answer the question, doctor, if you can.
Doctor, when you were, and I'll rephrase it. Doctor, when you were giving me an explanation previously, you indicated that a valid MMPI meant that the individual was truthful, correct?
We would not say truthful. Valid would be either they're exaggerating the problems or they're presenting themselves very positive. So it's not like a lie detector test where you use truthfulness.
Yes, but then what did you mean when you said truthful previously?
If they're being honest in how they're responding to it, it would be that there could be exaggerating problems or being minimizing the problem. So if I said the word truthful, it would be honest.
Okay, so you want to replace the word truthful with honest, correct?
Again, truthful sounds like the lie detector, and the MMPI is not a lie detector test.
An MMPI, valid results, means that the individual was being honest. Would you agree with that statement?
Honest in reporting their symptoms.
It wouldn't pick up a valid, on the flip side, a valid result would mean that they had not been dishonest, correct?
A valid response would be the neither exaggerating the problems nor trying to be presenting themselves overly positive.
And Colleen had a valid MMPI, did she not?
Her MMPI tended to be defensive and presenting herself as overly positive and minimizing any faults.
You did not previously indicate that her MMPI was valid.
Again, we're talking about the word valid. It usually means, for instance, if someone's inconsistent when they're answering, like they answer true, false, that would be invalid. If they're answering randomly or all true or all false, that would be invalid. So it was a valid response, but she tended to be minimizing and presenting herself very positively.
Dr. Colleen had a valid MMPI. Can we agree with that?
The way you're using valid is not the way the test used valid.
You didn't believe that she had been dishonest, correct?
Objection.
Counsel just approached briefly.
I'm not referring to the book.
I know. Ms. Mills, you can go ahead and ask that same question again,
Thank you, Your Honor.
if you like.
Doctor, just briefly, there was nothing dishonest in Colleen's MMPI results, correct?
It's not a question of honesty.
And actually, Colleen's credibility will really be judged by the jury, correct? And not
Objection.
yourself.
Sustained counsel, I just said. We're not going to that line of questioning. Move on.
Doctor, battered women can suffer from what's called hypervigilance, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and hypervigilance means that even though any of us might not pick a certain trade up, a certain look, a certain body movement from a batterer. Certainly a woman who has been abused by that batterer would take that indication as a threat, correct?
Hypervigilant means that just keyed into things happening in their environment, being a little bit suspicious, very much on edge of a lot of things in the environment, not just the person they're involved with.
But specifically to battered women syndrome, that hypervigilance is in the fear or the threat that that woman feels from her batterer, correct?
It's a more general than that, but that would be one factor. That's correct.
In fact, some battered women may make a preemptive strike before the abuser has actually inflicted the damage, correct?
Could you rephrase that, please?
Absolutely. In fact, in some cases with a battered woman, she may even make a preemptive strike before the abuser has actually inflicted the harm.
Correct.
And battered women also suffer from what's called cognitive inconsistency, correct?
Some do.
Okay. In fact, that inconsistency where they may give one statement and then another statement is slightly different is a result of having a very inconsistent relationship herself, where she loves the person who hurts her, correct?
I guess I'm a little bit unclear when you say cognitive inconsistency. There could be different feelings of being fearful of someone and also loving them. That's correct.
That's correct. Did you?
You can have two different emotions. It's correct.
You have two different emotions. You love the man that beat you, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And by loving the man that beats you, you live in a very inconsistent relationship, correct?
You have mixed feelings in the relationship.
And as a result of having those mixed feelings, sometimes you can give mixed signals or mixed statements relative to events that happen with that abuser. Isn't that correct?
No, that necessarily would not be correct.
In this particular example, a battered woman describes that her batterer hits her only when he is drunk, but then later would describe an episode in which... Can I give him a high?
Well, counsel, approach. You may continue, Ms. Mills.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, you did find that it was very likely that physical abuse had occurred between Rob and Colleen, correct?
No, I do not find that.
Doctor, do you have your report with you?
That's correct.
Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
Doctor, your statement that it is highly likely that Colleen and Rob did have physical as well as verbal arguments. Do you see what I'm reading?
Yes.
Okay. Did you not find then that it was highly likely that physical abuse had occurred?
Objection.
It's not-
I'm going to overrule the objection, but ask it again because I think you just said two different things. Rephrase it.
Doctor, did you not find that it was highly likely that physical altercations had occurred between Rob and Colleen?
Yes, it would tend that there were physical altercations and arguments between them, correct?
And Colleen described what she believed was the physical abuse that she suffered, correct?
She described the physical altercations that she committed and that she alleged that Rob committed.
Okay. She described how Rob slammed her down to the ground in the parking lot, correct?
She described that.
Okay. She described how she was smothered with a pillow until she lost consciousness, correct?
She alleged that.
Doctor, she didn't tell you she was alleging it. She told you about the event, correct?
Objection.
As to the phrasing of the question, rephrase. Sustain.
Doctor, she told you about the pillow over her face until she lost consciousness, correct?
That's what she told me.
Yes. And did she tell you then the next morning that Rob apologized?
She said he apologized the next morning.
Okay. And did she tell you about being slammed on the couch, shaken, and dragged down a hallway?
That's not how she related that incident.
What she believed to be physical abuse that occurred on November 22nd, 2014.
She talked to me about an incident on that date, correct?
On these three incidences, and I'm just going to refer to them, Doctor, as August, early November, and late November incidences, okay, for purposes of my questions.
Okay.
On each one of these incidents, she reported to you that she had suffered physical abuse, correct?
No, on each of those incidences, she said that after she assaulted him, he assaulted her back.
Okay, Doctor. On November, let's start with the pillow incident, and let's break this down. She reported to you that she was asleep when she woke up with a pillow over her face and she lost consciousness, correct?
That's what she said.
That's what she said to you. She did not report that she assaulted him while she was sleeping prior to that event, correct?
That was after they had an argument in the car that night, and she made that claim that he came back and did that to her.
Okay, so again, my question was on November 14th, there was no claim that she assaulted him in her sleep prior to this pillow incident, correct?
Not while she was asleep, that's correct.
Okay, and in August, there isn't any indication that Colleen assaulted Rob first.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled. You can answer.
Doctor, I'm sorry, you
Well,
can-
I'm sorry. Is it about a date?
Yes.
Okay. I think the objection is with regard to the date that is of the event, so I don't know.
Okay, I thought we were, thought in the beginning what we did is we were classifying the parking lot incident as August. I think it may be June, so that could possibly be my mistake. Let's say the summer incident of the Lou's parking lot. Do you know which incident I'm referring to, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll call it the summer incident, so we don't have a problem. In the summer incident, she certainly did not report to you that she physically assaulted Rob first, did she?
She told me that she punched him in the face and he then shoved her to the ground.
Yes, doctor, I understand, but she also told you that Rob had his hand over her mouth and had her arm back behind her head, in which she leaned forward to punch him to get away, correct?
Objection, Your Honor.
Well, overruled, it's cross.
She never said that. Put an arm behind her. She never said that.
So you had no knowledge of a prior abuse from Rob prior to what you have described as this punching in the face?
Objection as to the phrase, Your Honor.
Well, okay. We're going to be here for an hour going through word for word. If you would break your question down into smaller chunks, because you're asking him for a yes or no, but you're giving him several phrases. So if you would break it up phrase by phrase and allow him to answer, that might alleviate the problem. So overruled, and if you can do it that way, thank you, Ms. Mills.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, we're talking about the summer incident. Are you telling me you have no knowledge that Rob was physical with Colleen prior to what you have said that she punched him in the face?
I know what she told me happened before she punched him in the face, so I can say what she told me happened. She said that she was yelling at him, he put his hand on her mouth, she punched him in the face, and then he shoved her to the ground.
Okay. And doctor, I think that's what I was asking for. So Colleen did tell you, in fact, that Rob covered her mouth, correct? And that she punched him in the face in order to get away.
She
Correct?
didn't use that phrase, and she didn't say, my arm came back. She just said she put the hand over the mouth, and she punched him in the face.
Okay. So after he puts his hand over the mouth, she punches him in the face, and then he pushes her to the ground. Is that what you have reported?
That's how she described the incident to me.
All right, and you also read Dr. Resnick's report, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And Dr. Resnick describes that incident, correct?
I'd have to check his report if it's the same. But I know, I think in general he did, but I can't quote verbatim what exactly he said unless I look at it.
Okay. And the November 23rd,
Objection, Your Honor. He's
Well, if she doesn't want him to, she can move on. So
I-
overruled. If you want to move on, counsel, that's up to you.
thank you. And the November 22nd incident, doctor, in that particular case, she described that Rob had shook her violently and slammed her on the couch, correct?
That's not what she told me.
Did she tell you that Rob slammed her down on the couch?
No, she did not. She said she was sitting on the couch when Rob came in the house.
Okay. She was laying on the couch with the dog,
That's correct.
and he came over and he shook her and then shoved her, correct?
He came over and she said he put her hands on her shoulders and then her dog bit him.
And again, have you read Dr. Resnick's report?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And Dr. Resnick describes that incident in a little more detail, correct?
Dr. Resnick indicated that he shook her aggressively. And she told both of us, quote, I kicked him in the nuts.
And Dr. Colleen also told you that Rob had grabbed her by the hair when she tried to leave, and he pulled her by the hair down to the bedroom while she was kicking and screaming, correct?
That's what she said after she said she kicked him in the private. He fell to the floor, and then she claimed that he stopped her from leaving. She couldn't explain how he got off the floor and stopped her from leaving.
That was the description of what I just read, correct?
She alleged that he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the bedroom as she was kicking and screaming.
Now, in each one of those incidences, there's certainly quite a bit of tension between Rob and Colleen. Would you agree with that?
It appears in each of those incidents there wasn't tension to begin with. The tension began over arguments that Colleen admitted she started on each of those occasions, either earlier that night.
Doctor, you're certainly not saying that if Colleen started a verbal argument that she deserved any type of abuse, correct?
No, I didn't say that.
And the tension building phase that's described in the cycle, there's no requirement that the batter be the one that starts a verbal argument, correct?
No, that's not what the tension building stage means. They're talking about incidents that go on for weeks or months between these incidents. We're talking about one night, within hours, someone starts an argument, which Colleen admitted she usually did. Those arguments escalated. That's not what they talked about with the tension building stage.
Okay. You don't think there's any tension building when Rob doesn't want her to wear any makeup when she goes to work?
Objection. Overruled.
She never said that to me.
You don't think there's any tension building when Rob doesn't want her to go out with her friends?
She told me she went out with her friends all the time. Rob was on the road.
You don't think there's any tension building when Rob doesn't want her to go to the military?
She made that comment to me, but that's not necessarily tension building.
You don't think there's any tension building when Rob called Colleen a whore or a cunt or a bitch?
Again, these are words she used. I didn't hear anybody corroborate any of that information.
But that's what she told you, correct?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's tension building. That's what she's saying after the fact.
In those three incidences, if Rob was the first one to assault Colleen, would that meet the cycle of battered woman syndrome?
No, we're talking about different isolated incidents where they're both drinking, arguments start, and within hours or minutes it escalates. That's not what they talk about with a cycle of violence, which is going on for weeks and months. That's not what that refers to.
Someone who has been abused can't necessarily choose the time in which that abuse would occur, could they?
Someone can escalate situations or not escalate situations.
You're certainly not saying because Colleen may have been drinking on any of those occasions that for that reason the abuse did not occur, are you?
On all those occasions, alcohol was a key factor.
Doctor, you have seen the text message from Rob that states, I hate myself for ever putting my hands on you. I wish someone would beat my ass because that's definitely what the fuck I deserve. That is flat out bullshit. You've seen that text from Rob, correct?
That's correct.
You've seen that admission from Rob, correct?
That he grabbed her, correct.
And Colleen also told you that Rob threatened to kill himself on a number of occasions, correct?
She said that he threatened to kill himself once, or he made vague threats on other occasions.
I thought I read in your report on multiple occasions. Is that correct?
There was one incident where it was a direct threat, other ones were more vague. I think I'll kill myself if I lose you, that type of thing.
And she also told you that he threatened the animals, correct?
She said that he threatened the animals, correct.
And you had indicated that he made threats that if Colleen left, that he would either hurt the animals or possibly do something to the house, I think was your statement, correct?
That's what she said, correct.
Okay. You have also read Dr. Resnick's report in which it indicated she says that he threatened her if he would leave, correct?
That she threatened what?
I'm sorry, Doctor.
What's the last word you said?
I apologize. You also read Dr. Resnick's report, correct? Prior to your evaluation?
That's correct.
All right, and prior to that evaluation, you're reading that report, you see that Colleen stated to Dr. Resnick that Rob also threatened her if she would leave him, correct?
He never made that statement. I didn't see that in his report that he threatened.
You never saw that in Dr. Resnick's statement,
That he
that Rob
threatened
threatened Colleen?
Threatened how?
That he would harm her, stalk her, knew everybody in Maslin, was never going to let her go? Did you see any of those statements, doctor?
What I saw in his report is, according to what she told Dr. Resnick, is he would make her life a living hell if she left. But
Thank you.
not these other statements you're making.
Okay, so Rob would make her life a living hell. You had that report prior to your evaluation with Colleen, correct?
Correct.
Doctor, you are not board certified, is that correct?
That's not a phrase that psychologists use.
Are you board certified in psychology?
Psychology, you get your PhD in clinical psychology. And a physician gets their medical degree, then they get a specialty in like psychiatry, and they come board certified in psychiatry. I got my PhD in clinical psychology. There is no board to take.
So there's no way for you to become board certified, if I understand that.
It's not a phrase that psychologists generally use.
I don't recall seeing on your resume that you worked at the court's psychiatric clinic in Cuyahoga County.
That should be on the resume.
Okay, what years did you work there?
I worked there in 1985 to 1987.
And were you terminated from that organization?
No, I left to become the director of the court clinic in Boston, Massachusetts, where I was from.
Didn't you leave on a sour note?
No,
Objection.
Sustained. Counsel, approach. Objection is sustained. You may ask another question.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Doctor, a woman does not have to have low self-esteem in order to suffer from battered woman syndrome, correct?
That's one characteristic, but all women suffer from battered women syndrome don't necessarily have to have low self-esteem.
And all women don't have to have any physical evidence of bruises in order to suffer from battered woman syndrome, correct?
That's correct. Not all women need to have the physical evidence.
And battered woman syndrome encompasses not only physical but psychological abuse, correct?
That's correct.
Doctor, I just want to talk briefly. You had made the statement that you reviewed the booking video, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And that during the booking video, Colleen makes the statement that it takes 7 times for a woman to report her abuser or something to that effect, correct?
Something to that effect.
Okay. And the police officer that she's speaking to agrees with her on that statistic.
I don't remember the police officer was just agreeing or not agreeing to her on that.
Okay. And then there's the statement that even longer to leave, correct?
There was something to that effect, correct?
Okay. And she doesn't actually describe the cycles in this booking video, correct?
No, she just used the statistic about 7 times, but she didn't describe that.
And after she cites that statistic, she says, I now know how they feel, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Overruled.
She said something like that around that time. I think she said something like, I get it now, was the phrase that she used.
Thank you. I get it now. I now know how they feel, something to that
I don't know if
effect.
she said that part, but I just wrote down, I get it now.
And thank you, doctor. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. That completely took the thought out of my head.
It's okay. Take your time.
She didn't cite any specific cycles within that booking video that you reviewed, correct?
She just used the phrase 7 times for a woman to make a police report.
Right, and I appreciate that, but this cycle that we have been talking about, tension building, abuse, contrition or apology, that's not cited in the booking video anywhere, correct?
That's correct.
And you would agree with me that 2 cycles of the tension building, the act itself, physical or psychological, and the apology, 2 of those cycles then is the criteria to determine that someone suffers from battered woman syndrome, correct?
No, the cycle of violence have not been documented by research. Even Lenore Walker's that a third of the women don't go through the cycle of tension building, a third don't go through the contrition cycle. So the cycle of violence has not been supported in the majority of the cases.
Well, but in Ms. Walker's statement that not all women need the entire cycle, she was actually stating that even more women could qualify for battered women syndrome, not less. Correct, doctor?
No, she was, again, it shows why it's not a diagnosis. It was something that she said on her first research, then had to backtrack on it.
Well, it's not a diagnosis, but we've established that it's recognized, correct?
That's correct.
And I think Lenore Walker first started talking about this in the 80s, correct?
Probably even late 70s.
Okay, so we've got 50 plus years of research and discussions on battered women syndrome, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. As to the math, but I think we get where she's going.
Over 50 years.
No, I think late 70s.
Over 30
would
years.
be, yeah. 40.
Sorry about that.
Maybe 40.
Over 30 years of research on battered women syndrome,
There's
correct?
been a lot of research over the years, correct?
And it does exist, correct?
There's strong evidence in the psychological community that it doesn't exist. That it's not valid, it's not reliable, there is no syndrome. women suffer on a case-to-case basis with different symptoms, but there is no syndrome, and the majority of the research does not support that it is a syndrome. That's why it's not been included in any of the psychiatric or psychological diagnoses.
Doctor, are you a professor at Mount Union?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and I think you teach, correct me if I'm wrong, a psychology course, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and the book that you utilize for your psychology course is Valero, Forensic
Yes.
Psychology 3rd edition, correct?
That's correct.
This book is what you're teaching your students, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And there is a few sections on battered women syndrome within this book, is there not?
There's one chapter that is in the book, correct?
Okay. Syndrome evidence, battered women syndrome, and rape trauma syndrome. Sound familiar for the chapter?
That's correct.
Okay. And nowhere in this book does it say battered women syndrome doesn't exist, does it?
That's what the book says, but then my lecture tells the students that the research does not support it, and that version is about 9 years old that you have.
Okay, so I want to backtrack because I either heard a double negative or I didn't hear that quite right. You would admit that this book teaches what battered women syndrome is, correct?
No, it puts their views about battered women syndrome, and then as a professor, you let them know what other research exists and what is valid and what's not.
Okay. Doctor, you chose this book for your students, correct?
No, my predecessors chose that book.
Okay. Well, certainly for this semester, if somebody wants to take your course and they get into the Power Campus, it's going to show, they have James, excuse me, but it would be Dr. Karpowicz, and they would have this book,
That's correct.
okay? And so your students then all will have this book, correct?
Yes, that's the textbook.
I mean, that would be required for them to take your class, correct?
Strongly recommended that they get the textbook.
I think that that would be helpful. And in this particular textbook, nowhere in this textbook does it say that battered women syndrome does not exist.
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
No,
Overruled.
nowhere in this book does it say it doesn't exist, correct?
That book doesn't say it correct.
Okay, but yet you tell your students that it doesn't exist? Did I understand your testimony properly?
No, what I tell the students is the research says is it's not a very valid or credible diagnosis. It's not recognized in the community. So I take a textbook, then I add other research and my own experience to what I teach the students.
It's still recognized in the state of Ohio, though, correct?
And the state of, in the law, it is.
If I could just have a few moments, Sharon.
You may.
I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Mills.
No
Ms.
redirect,
Day?
Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Karpowicz, you can step down. Counsel, approach over here. You don't have to turn around. It's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take our afternoon recess. And by afternoon recess, I mean overnight recess. You are going to be excused for the day. because it is now 3:26, and I would indicate to you that I do expect to be able to get this case into your hands tomorrow. So, again, the admonitions that I've been giving all along are in place. Do not discuss the case among yourselves or with anyone else. Do not allow anyone to discuss it in your presence. Do not form or express an opinion on the case until it is finally submitted to you. Do not attempt to independently investigate or research this case or any of the issues contained within it in any way, shape, or form, including the internet. And please, please, please avoid any media reports regarding the coverage of this trial. You know all of the reasons there are for that. Please do what you have been doing as far as avoiding that in your evening tonight. I would ask that you return tomorrow morning to the jury assembly room. I'm going to ask that you return slightly later. I do expect that we will be moving into closing arguments and instructions at some point in the morning. So I would ask that you report to the jury assembly room at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Again, please follow the admonitions and please enjoy your evenings. Remember to leave your badges here tonight. We are in recess.